Starting this video off with a hot take. If you were to ask me, out of everyone in the Norwegian black metal scene when it was booming in the early 90s, who was the most versatile in terms of songwriting skill, musicianship, and overall talent, my answer would easily go to Emperor. For those who are unaware, which I doubt this is news for many people, Emperor are one of the essentials and pioneers to that of Norwegian black metal that formed all the way back in the year of 1991. The two main members that most people associate with Emperor are Ishan, who is the vocalist and guitarist for Emperor, and Samuth, who originally was the drummer but later on became the rhythm guitarist. Prior to Emperor forming in 1991, Ishan and Samuth were actually acquainted with each other before, in the year of 1990, when their own personal bands at the time, which were only cover bands when they were doing shows in Norway, actually met at a gig, and this is where they got acquainted with each other. With Ishan only being 15 years old and Samuth being 16 years old, basically teenagers, they were actually able to release quite a handful of demos in such a short time period from 1990 to 1991, as they were in essentially one band that had multiple name changes, starting it off with Exracia, then Embryonic, and finally ending with Thou Shalt Suffer. That all of these bands and the releases that they had were more in vein to that of death metal, sounding more like Morbid Angel than anything else. And while it's nothing that I would say is anything similar to that of Emperor besides it having Ishan and Samuth, it's just really interesting to know where their musical ambitions started and where the ball started rolling for them to basically continue on and work together in the future. But with black metal becoming more prevalent in Norway, especially in the early 90s, as you all know, Ishan and Samuth would jump on board and start the band that we all know them for being in, Emperor. And in 1992, they released their debut demo called Wrath of the Tyrant. As I'm sure you can imagine, for a black metal demo to be released in 1992, the quality standards for this are really lo-fi and raw as all hell. Yet, even with that stated, it still has a lot of interesting ideas and compositions that make this honestly tasteful, as there's a lot of melody kind of laced in throughout it. The keyboards utilized showcase that they had an idea going, but they didn't really have the tools at the time necessary to really execute a demo, at least at the time, truly to the compositional skills that we know them for now anyways. That even though it's really raw, as I stated, and the vocal performance by Ishan is really primitive with the reverb just echoing throughout it, it's still a demo that's worth checking out. That I would arguably say, out of all of the Norwegian black metal bands that were releasing demos during the Norwegian black metal boom of the early 90s, Emperor has some of the best stuff you can find in their discography, that I would not sleep on any of it. Other things that are interesting to point out with this demo is at the time Emperor would only be a three-piece, as it would have Ishan, which at the time his stage name was something like Yig, it was YGG. This would be the only release he would refer to his stage name as such. Samuth would only be playing the drums, and their bass player at the time was Mortis, which this would be the only release he would ever be a part of Emperor, and soon after would start his own project called Mortis, and this is where he would become a big pioneer to that of the genre known as Dungeon Synth. A year later, in 1993, Emperor would release their self-titled debut EP, Emperor. This EP was 20 minutes long and contained 4 tracks. However, 2 of these tracks were re-recordings from the previous demo, that being Wrath of the Tyrant, the title track, along with Night of the Graveless Souls, where the 2 new songs were Cosmic Keys to My Creation and Times, along with a fan favorite song being I Am the Black Wizards. A huge resource that allowed Emperor to re-record 2 songs, along with just releasing this EP in general, was the fact that this would be their first release that was ever put out under a label, that being Candlelight. And still to this day, Emperor is still signed to Candlelight Records. And the only other thing to add here in terms of the marketing, I guess, with this release, is that all the material you can find on this EP would also carry over to the split that Emperor would do with Enslaved in the same year. As for the music that you can hear on this EP, it is definitely worth checking out, and some of Emperor's best material you'll find, as the ideas that were carried over from Wrath of the Tyrant are present on this, only they are way more fleshed out and just showcase a lot more maturity, I would say, as the production value is obviously beefed up. It still has that raw, gritty nature you would want in black metal, especially for the Norwegian scene of that time. The vocal performance by Sean is way thicker and just hits with a lot more impact. And I would overall say the guitar riffs are more easy to understand, just all the melodies coming forth and hitting you. And the drum performance is just absolutely blistering fast and awesome. Just overall, I would say if you want to just get into Emperor and you don't want to start with the obvious, album, that being In the Night Side Eclipse, which I'll be talking about in a second, strongly recommend not to ignore this particular EP. On a more personal note, one thing I've always found that's really cool about this particular EP is not so much the music, but the visuals and aesthetic of it, as Emperor would be one of the first ever black metal bands to utilize Gustave Doré artwork for their album covers. Because prior to Emperor, there really wasn't that many bands in any music scene using Gustave Doré artwork, other than what I was able to search up online. There was a very short list. There was a few hardcore punk bands such as The Mad and Bad Religion back in the early 80s, and the only metal band that I was able to come across that used a Gustave Doré artwork piece for their album cover was Candlemass back in 1989 with their album Tales of Creation. So while again this has nothing to do with the music, and I know I'm kind of like rambling on here about useless information, I just think it's really cool that Emperor was, at least from my knowledge and what I was able to search up, one of, if not the first black metal band to use Gustave artwork on a regular basis. And the last bit of information to bring up with this EP is that this would be their first release where they would have their drummer that is very infamous, known as Faust. Infamy will always be attached to Emperor in some sort of degree, mainly because of Faust when he committed murder back on August 21st, 1992 on a bystander of Magna Andersson, who was a gay man who approached Faust after he was very intoxicated coming out of a bar, and Faust agreed to pursue Andersson into the forest, only for Faust to end up stabbing that individual 37 times and then kicking his head in to making sure that he ended up murdering this individual. With the police having no leads or suspects to pursue, Faust was actually able to get away with this murder for over a year, hence why he was able to do all of the recordings for the debut full-length album for Emperor, In the Night Side Eclipse, which I'll get to talking about in a second. However, in the year of 1993, with all the chaos happening in Norway with Varg murdering Euronymous, it would only be about a week later that Faust would come clean to the police of everything that was going on in Norway, from obviously Varg murdering Euronymous, Faust murdering Andersson, to even the church burnings and all the people associated with those arsons. And with that, Faust was sentenced to prison in 1994 for a maximum of 14 years, yet he would be released in 2003 for good behavior, only serving a little over 9 years. And while Emperor pursued on with their musical careers, the reason as to why they entered even more controversy is back in 2014 when Emperor would do their reunion show in their 20th anniversary of In the Night Side Eclipse. The festival that they played at for that show, they also let back in Faust to play drums for that live performance. And for a lot of people, it was quite the controversial decision to allow an individual who was convicted for murder back into your band to play at a live event. While I am aware that what I'm doing is just some really low budget, crappy YouTube video, and I really don't expect to change anyone's minds on the subject matter other than, just putting in my 2 cents and hopefully adding to the conversation at the very least. Because when it comes to the conversation of Faust and Emperor, I can understand to all of the resentment and disapproval people had with Emperor allowing Faust to come back into the band at any point, even if it was for just that one show. However, this is where I start wondering, where does an individual, regardless of what they did, have the ability to ever gain redemption at any point in their life? Because again, I get the fact that when you look at the events that took place, Faust murdered someone. And even though he was a very young individual, I think he was either like a teenager or a very young adult who ended up murdering Anderson, who was a gay man, and a lot of people look at it like it was this homophobic attack. It was more so because, even though I'm not trying to excuse this, from my understanding of the Until the Light Takes Us documentary that Faust said a few words, is that he was purposely going out to murder someone. It was anyone, and just so happened that Anderson was an easy target. And while it's still an incredibly messed up thing that he did, I don't think it was mainly because he was trying to find a gay man or do any kind of like homophobic attack. It was just like in this edgy nature of what black metal was during that time, especially when you have people like, Euronymous saying all of his bullshit and all the crazy, arsons that they were doing, church burnings. It just seemed like such a chaotic place during that time period. And going to prison for like the decade that he did, I know it was a little under 10 years, not like 9 years and 4 months to be exact. This is where I start wondering, again, like I stated, when does redemption come into play? Because clearly Faust has some sort of regret for doing such a heinous act. One example being when Gull, the vocalist of Gorgoroth, finally came out for being gay. Faust was one of the first individuals to showcase his support to Gull. And again, referencing the Until the Light Takes Us documentary, Faust is completely blacked out with a voice modulator, showcasing to me anyway that he has a lot of shame and despair for the acts that he committed. And while yes, Emperor did allow him back in 2014 to play at a festival, to state that now Emperor are these terrible people for allowing this, I think is a bit too far. Because again, while Faust did something heinous, are we really going to now blame the band themselves, like, Isan and Samoth, for being terrible people? I think that's kind of a stretch from some of the videos I've seen on YouTube saying that we should damn them to hell for allowing this. Because again, I don't think Emperor are the infamous terrible people, but Faust, the individual, for the act that he committed, I can understand that. But see, here's where now in the conversation where I feel like it gets a bit controversial, and again, I'm aware that I'm this like crappy YouTube channel. I'm not really trying to force my opinion or state that this is correct and I want everyone to agree with me here, but I really start wondering, when do we allow redemption for an individual? Because again, he showcases remorse and despair and shame for what he did, and obviously he hasn't done anything terrible since then. He served his time going to prison. So when do we allow redemption? Or in this case, for a lot of people, which again I understand, is it just going to tarnish his legacy and reputation until the day he dies, basically? So I really don't feel like there is a correct answer with this, other than I'm just really curious to know what are your opinions and just overall viewpoints on the subject matter. Other than that, I don't want to drag this event through the mud, so let's just continue on with talking about the music of Emperor. By doing so, this is where we reach the year of 1994, and we finally get to talk about the fan-favorite album that Emperor is most known for, that obviously being their debut in the Nightside Eclipse. For a lot of people, not only is this the pinnacle of Norwegian black metal, but a lot of people state that this is the pinnacle for just black metal itself. The most difficult thing I ask myself is what truly is the star of the show with this album? What is the key component that really makes this special? And I would argue literally everything, from the guitar riffs that are sinister yet very melodic, to the drumming that's really pummeling throughout and just makes everything all the more energetic and chaotic but very engaging, to Hassan's vocal performance that is just so wretched yet so climactic whenever he spews out his vocals. The execution on here is fucking awesome. To the keyboards that are utilized, that have more of like this backdrop effect to everything, that gives the idea that you're trying to just like engulfed in this kind of like icy cold atmosphere that really kind of like transports you to like this mythical land, to the production value that is just so dense and thick and just makes everything all the more just monstrous and larger than life sounding. It's an album that I feel like is just an essential for really any extreme metal fan to just truly understand what can come out of black metal. And for a lot of people, yes, this is the first real representation of what symphonic black metal is. Although I have seen arguments that state that this really isn't a symphonic black metal album at all, and Emperor really hasn't stuck the landing on that style of music just yet, as the keyboards are utilized more as just a backdrop. They really haven't brought any of like the classical elements to what symphonic extreme metal kinda is. However, I would argue against that, mainly because when you listen to songs like Beyond the Great Vast Forest and Into the Pantheon, they're utilized more as like choirs almost, and how the guitars are also played as well. While yes, they're really melodic and sinister sounding, there is kind of like this idea of like classical kind of like embedded in what the writing and overall execution is. That, yeah, I can understand that the keyboards are used more as like a backdrop, but all the instrumentation, especially, you know, the guitar riffs, give off a sense of classical music that's kind of embedded in there. So one could argue it's a prototype to what symphonic black metal is. Another would argue it's just a black metal album with keyboards that add, a backdrop. But for me personally, I can understand, and I would argue that it is the first real representation of symphonic black metal, if you want to get really nerdy with the subgenre category of it. Also, I want to add that the song The Majesty of the Night Sky is my personal favorite Emperor song, because God, the intro to the guitar solo to just that explosion that happens at the end of the song, it is just such a kick-ass track. And I know, regardless, everyone's either heard this album or you should just listen to every single song on the album to really understand just the sheer magnitude and the impact that this album has done for extreme metal as a whole, but that particular song sold me enough to just buy the LP back when I came across it like a handful of years ago. Regardless of how you categorize it, there's no denying it that the impact that this album has on extreme metal will be forever lasting. Because what makes it just so ambitious and really groundbreaking for its time is that back in the early 90s into 94, where Emperor released this album, there wasn't really that many extreme metal bands that were playing around with keyboards to any sense of degree, other than a really short list like Psy with Scorn Defeat, Master's Hammer with The Ritual, and Nocturnus's The Key. But even though they utilized keyboards, they never went to the extent that Emperor did, making it really known throughout the album with every single song, and making it as climactic or really engulfing the listener to the extent that Emperor did. Hence why, again, I really do argue that this is one of the most influential and groundbreaking albums in all of black metal. I know at this point I'm just preaching to the choirs here, but for anyone who knows of this album, they'll agree it's incredible. And for anyone who has yet to listen to it for whatever reason, get on this album ASAP. But again, I doubt that's many of you, if any of you, to begin with at all. However, for a lot of people, at least from what I've noticed, a lot of people just tend to state that this is it for Emperor. This is their peak, and there's really nothing else to talk about with them. It's just, they're the band that released In the Nightside Eclipse, and why pursue just listening to anything else in their catalog? And if that's your attitude, please change that immediately, because there are two following EPs that they would release after In the Nightside Eclipse. I would state in terms of quality, musicianship, and just the overall songwriting is just as good as In the Nightside Eclipse. One of those EPs was actually released in the same year in 1994, being As the Shadows Rise, which it's only 3 tracks and it contains a little over like 11 minutes of material, but good God, this is easily Emperor at their most savage. Mainly because all 3 of these songs were found on the debut demo, Wrath of the Tyrant, but they're all re-recordings. And holy damn hell, this is easily Emperor at their most savage, primitive, and aggressive. Because even though it still has like the mentality and overall execution of the demo of Wrath of the Tyrant, it being re-recorded, now you can actually make out all the instrumentation and vocals that they were trying to do on the demo. And it, like I stated, it is so ungodly primitive and savage. The drumming on this will just bulldoze your eardrums. But again, you can make out the guitar riffs that are so sinister and match up with the savagery of the drumming. Hassan's vocal performance really starts to stretch his boundaries of what he can do with the shrieks and screamings that he does. It's, again, only a little over 11 minutes long, but it is so worth the listen, again, if you want Emperor at their most savage. Then, 3 years later, in 1997, Emperor would release another EP called Reverence. Once again, another short EP that only contains 3 songs, and it's a little over 16 minutes long. But again, if you're looking for that sinister, icy cold symphonic take for black metal, Emperor nails it once again with this EP. With the opening track on here, The Loss and Curse of Reverence, which would be one of the songs for the forthcoming album, Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. Which I know some people don't like that particular album because this is where Emperor gets way off course with like the true and purest take for black metal. However, their rendition on this EP of that particular song, I think is more accustomed to the overall production and execution standpoint to that of In the Nightside Eclipse. And just that alone with that song is worth checking out this EP. As for the other 2 songs, In Longing Spirit, again, another re-recording of a previous song that Emperor did, which ever since they got signed to Candlelight, they've just been re-recording songs during this particular time period. I'm guessing mainly because they were like perfectionists or something like that. But goddamn, they stick the landing on everything and enhance everything about these songs, which just makes this track even better in my personal view. As for the outro song being Opus A Santana, I think it is, it's just purely an instrumental track of just all like symphonic keyboards being played, but it's honestly really good of an outro, how epic and how much it builds up to something, that the musicianship skill of Emperor is still really prevalent around this particular time. That honestly, for me personally, I wish the outro was the intro for this EP. It would really flow with the EP better. But regardless, as I stated, I really do feel like a lot of the demos and EP of the early era of Emperor is often ignored, that I would highly recommend checking out, because personally for me, in terms of their production, presentation, songwriting, musicianship skill, and just every little thing you can think of, it's just as good as In the Nightside Eclipse in my personal view. A few short months after Reverence was released, Emperor would finally do a follow-up full-length album to In the Nightside Eclipse and release their second full-length album, Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk. This would also be the first release that Emperor would have a well-established and consistent drummer, that being Trym Thorson, who I would argue is more versatile than anyone Emperor ever allowed as a drummer, as he has a strong background in jazz music. And because of this versatility that he had, it allowed Emperor to really explore a lot of different ideas. Because when it comes to Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk, it becomes really divisive, I've noticed, among the Emperor fan base. Because one thing I've noticed about Emperor's fan base is that it's divided into 3 categories. You have the Emperor fans that I would consider to be the black metal purists, that enjoy everything from the beginning of Emperor's discography up until In the Nightside Eclipse. Then you have the symphonic black metal fans, who again enjoy everything from the beginning of Emperor's discography up until Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk. And then the third one is just the pure Emperor fan, who just enjoys everything that Emperor did. And these people are probably the individuals that bought that crazy box set that was released by Blood Music back in 2017 called like something like Emperor's The Complete Works, that has like over 20 LPs, and I think at the time retail price it was like what, $700 or $800, which is just so freaking crazy of an asking price. But good God, I can't believe something like that exists. What makes Anthem so different from In the Nightside Eclipse is that within the Nightside Eclipse, the keyboards and symphonic elements were used more in this like minimalist way as just a backdrop, so it would just like engulf the listener and that's it. Where Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk, this is where I truly feel like now Emperor has really become a fully fleshed out symphonic black metal band, and they add a lot of bells and whistles to their overall arsenal when it came to how they would write music. because this album is way more monumental sounding. It's not as subtle when it comes to the symphonic and keyboard elements. And yeah, I can understand the transitions between In the Night Side Eclipse and Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk. It's not as subtle anymore, and it just becomes a lot more explosive. So I can understand the differences. However, for me personally, I hate to sound like maybe a hipster, even though I'm kind of like dressed like one for this video, but I would arguably say, out of everything in the Emperor discography, this is their magnum opus. One of the key differences is just the overall mentality that Emperor had when making Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk. Because in an interview that Ihsahn did describing the differences between In the Night Side Eclipse and Anthems, is that when it came to In the Night Side Eclipse, it felt like it was more of like just two EPs kind of like conjoined together, as half the album has material that they did from previous EPs and demo, and the other half is new material. So the mindset was just like not as consistent. Whereas Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk, to Ihsahn and company, this is like their real first true embark on making a fully cohesive album. Thus, for me personally, I feel like the overall album from beginning to end feels more in line with the overall attitude, songwriting, and musicianship that I would say when it comes to In the Night Side Eclipse, I can listen to song like bit by bit, where when it comes to Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk, I really do feel like I need to listen to this album from beginning to end. Musically, this album is way more cataclysmic, as the symphonic elements feel more urgent and give off more of the sense that they're really trying to engulf themselves in more of like this classical influence now. It feels like it's more of like this classical piece from centuries ago, only they fueled it with black metal and extreme metal instrumentation. The guitarists have a lot more flair to it and just feel as if they're giving off more of a punch. Again, maybe I just sound like a generic metal fan, but I just feel like the aggression and overall urgency of this gives it a much more larger-than-life aspect to it compared to In the Night Side Eclipse. And that's one thing too maybe I'm guilty of with a lot of other people, is that this album is always compared to In the Night Side Eclipse, Anthems. And I feel like when you do that, this is where you start like devaluing this album as a whole. So again, just as the kind of like interpretation of like someone who enjoys symphonic black metal, this really just feels like a very cataclysmic album that if you want that larger-than-life approach with just all these bells and whistles and all these attributes of an album that flows evenly and doesn't feel like it's just overstepping the boundaries of extreme metal and being cohesive, yeah, Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk arguably is and should be considered a masterpiece by, extreme metal standards. However, when you fast forward 2 years to 1999, Emperor would release their third full-length album titled Equilibrium. One thing I've noticed is that when it comes to talking about Equilibrium among the Emperor fans, most of them anyway, it seems like this album just never existed along with Prometheus, the follow-up, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I think what Emperor was trying to do with Equilibrium is the same thing they did with In the Night Side Eclipse and progressed on with Anthems, is that Anthems was going to be In the Night Side Eclipse, only there's going to be a lot more bells and whistles added to it in their musical inventory. They just did the same thing from Anthems now on to Equilibrium. More bells and whistles, let's add even more ideas. The problem with that is, for me at least, it's hard to get immersed in this album just solely because of all the different transitions, all the symphonic elements come in and out. And I start wondering, where's really even the black metal anymore? It's like, basic as I sound here, because Emperor's always been a black metal band, yet with Equilibrium, you're really noticing now that black metal is in the minority in terms of influence, symphonic, progressive, and a lot more of just this like explosive extreme metal that's more accustomed to death metal, especially with the guitarists that have more groove and a lot more aggression to it seem to be prevalent. That for me, it doesn't really sound so much like an Emperor album as it does sound more familiar to that of something that Septic Flesh would have done. Personally, I don't find it to be like this abomination that's terrible that you just should never listen to it. But if you enjoy everything previous to Emperor from Equilibrium, I can understand as to why you wouldn't enjoy this, because it really does sound like a different band. There's nothing really that like black metal fueled about it. Even the vocal performance by his son is nowhere as like sharp as it is on the previous albums. He does a lot more yelling, that it doesn't really have like the shrieks that you're accustomed to hearing, so that's another big change as well. And clean singing is a lot more prevalent on this album. Just overall how I view it in like a really kind of like basic way is that In the Nightside Eclipse was an album that was meant to take you to like this mystical, evil kind of like fantasy world on how they wrote the album. Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk was an album that was written for like as if like a Gustave Doré painting were to be real. Like, how would you describe that in a musical sense? That's what they kind of did with Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk. Equilibrium kind of sounds like, hey, what if we made music for both like the masses, for both heaven and hell? And it just kind of feels like they're overstepping their boundaries for what they can really do as a band. And again, they really kind of detach themselves from like the black metal sound that they started with. And again, I can totally understand as to why the Emperor fans that were fans of them from the start do not care for Equilibrium. Before I get talking about Prometheus, the last full-length album in the Emperor catalog, I also want to plug in and talk about really quickly, in 1999, Emperor would do a split with Thorns, which I would argue this is the last great thing Emperor would release, as not only do you get some killer material by Emperor in vein of symphonic black metal, but Thorns offers some killer material in vein of industrial black metal. Plus it's really cool too that both Thorns and Emperor would do a cover of each other's songs. Just overall, I think this is a really killer split. So many people sleep on it, and I don't see enough people talking about it, and some don't even know that it even exists. So definitely check this out if you want more killer black metal and just really want to just, indulge yourself in the Emperor discography that, again, I really do feel like is often ignored because so many people put such great attention onto the full lengths. As for the fourth and final full-length album by Emperor, it would be Prometheus, The Discipline of Fire and Demise. Just like Equilibrium, again, this album is often ignored by most of the Emperor fan base. And while I can understand what they did with Equilibrium, that I don't think it's a bad album, it's just they changed so much that, a lot of the people that were established with Emperor from the beginning, it's understandable why they have distaste for it, even though I do still think it's still well written for what they're trying to do. Prometheus is an album that I have a very difficult time just trying to overall enjoy it. The reason for that is because once again they continue this pattern of just adding in more bells and whistles. It's like they're always trying to expand their sound to the next level and showcase more of these progressive elements bleeding through. My real big problem with it is that even though there's roughly around like 9 songs, it really feels like I heard like 50 different tracks because the transitions come and go so frequently. Like, averagely these tracks on this album are roughly around like 5 to like 6.5 minutes long. Yet, in these songs that range around those like lengths, it really feels like I heard like 4 different tracks. It's really hard to engulf myself in this album, really feel immersed, when every few minutes it's like we're gonna change it up again. We had choirs 1 minute, now we have like these fast, aggressive, extreme metal parts the next. Then Hassan's gonna do some clean singing, then he's gonna do his wretched screaming, then he's gonna have harsh vocals coming next, then there's gonna be a lot of blast beats, and it's gonna go right back to the symphonic elements. Like, there's so many things happening and nothing feels cohesive, that what it feels like to me is that Emperor, when writing this album, had like a million ideas in their heads, and instead of fleshing it out, brainstorming what might work and connect well, they just thought to themselves with these million ideas, what if we use all of them on this album? Like, goddamn, I don't want to be like really overly critical on this album and try to find the silver lining of what's enjoyable of it, but it's hard to immerse myself in this. Again, I just really feel like they're shooting in the dark and having every idea come at them. And because of that, I really feel like it's a huge reason as to why so many people ignore this album. Again, they're playing in the realm of like extreme progressive metal. the black metal ideas that really made them a well-established band, not only in Norway, but all of just extreme metal as a whole. It feels like they just gave up on those crucial, essential things that made them special in favor of just new ideas. And I understand, again, this is their last full-length album, and shortly after this they would disband, and Hassan would do like his own personal project that's like self-titled, that again he bleeds out more of these like progressive ideas with his musical writing. So I can understand as to how this is kind of like the beginning of the end for Emperor, but it's kind of showcasing what Hassan would do with his own personal stuff. I can understand that and like the silver lining of it, but just overall as an album, I hate to state this, it's just really not that well written. It's executed well, it's performed well, but the pacing and writing is just honestly a mess. However, in the end though, after the release of Prometheus, Emperor would decide to call it quits and disband in 2001. And it wasn't because any of the band members had any animosity towards each other or the fact that they were burnt out. It was mainly due for the fact that everyone in Emperor felt as if Emperor had reached its peak. They toured all across the globe, they released 4 full-length albums, and there was an article back in 2003, which I can't find, that stated that Emperor sold roughly around 500,000 copies, making them one of, if not the highest selling black metal band to ever exist. Shortly after the band disbanded in 2001, everyone pursued their own personal projects, as Hassan would start his own band after his stage name that's more in vein of progressive metal and classical tendencies, where Semoth and Torson would start the band Zyklone, which is kind of like a mixture of black metal, death metal, and industrial that's really good and often ignored, that you guys should definitely check out. But it would only be a short time later, in 2005, where Emperor would start doing reunion shows. For a handful of years on and off, Emperor would do like these festival-only exclusive shows, or do like these really short tours. And I think it mainly has to do with the fact that they're kind of well aware at this point of the success that they had and all of the fans wanting more out of them. And while they've always teased at the idea of like a follow-up after Prometheus, it never really fell through. Thus, Emperor really just stays with Prometheus being their last album. However, as the years have progressed on and they've done more festivals and kind of like reunion shows, they kind of seem again to be more apparent of the idea that Emperor is just this live performance band anymore, that they'll only do shows exclusive to that, of either in the Nightside Eclipse, played in full, or most recently over the past handful of years, they've done shows of an exclusive performance of a set of just Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk. Stating also, as well as his song has stated, he's more pursuing just his own personal projects, just like a Samoth, but making it more as if like Emperor is a side project. That yeah, it's more of like an idea of like it's paying the bills definitely for this band, but really just paying more of a tribute and homage to the fans that just want that sound to continue on, and Emperor being just kind of aware of it. In the end though, Emperor is a very influential band, and regardless of what you think of the latter half in their catalog, the stuff that they released from their beginnings to up until 1997, I think is just legendary. It deserves that status. And all of the bands that they've influenced, especially if there's any black metal bands that play around with keyboards or symphonic elements, are immediately compared to Emperor, and a majority of them will just straight up admit that a lot of their influences come from Emperor, especially in the Nightside Eclipse. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, links provided to what was playing in the background will be in the description below. And yeah, really curious to know what you guys think of Emperor, but I'm sure what I'm going to hear and what I've said, I'm just basically preaching to the choir at this point. But regardless, always want to make a video on Emperor. And yeah, other than that, make sure, like always, guys, you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day. Finally, I can take off this goddamn fucking turtleneck. It's been itching me like crazy.